Israel, Palestine, the most disputed piece of real estate in all the world. What is its real name? Who owns it? What people have a rightful claim to this land? Let us travel to the oldest traditions and history of this land in order to find out. Abraham is considered to be the founder of the three major religions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The oldest record of the life of Abraham is the book of Genesis. Based on the biblical record, Abraham lived during the early Bronze Age, around 2,000 years before Christ. He lived in Ur of the Chaldeans, located in modern-day Iraq. He immigrated to the land of Canaan, which today are the nations of Israel, Jordan, and parts of Syria. God made him a promise that he was going to bless him, and out of him would come a great nation that would occupy this land. The inhabitants of Canaan were known as Canaanites. They were made up of different ethnic groups, and they held a variety of religious beliefs and practices. They were never unified as one political kingdom. The book of Genesis says that Abraham had a son named Isaac. The blessings promised to Abraham were going to come through Isaac. According to the promise, through him all the nations of the earth would be blessed. From Isaac, the promise went to one of his sons, Jacob. God changed his name to Israel, and the nation that came from these patriarchs would be known by his name. Jacob and his family immigrated to Egypt after a famine in the land. Generations after his death, the Egyptians enslaved the Hebrews, and they lived in captivity until the Exodus. The biblical account of the Exodus says, the time that the people of Israel lived in Egypt was 430 years. The Hebrews returned to the land of Abraham and conquered a number of Canaanite kingdoms, although the Canaanites remained living among the Hebrews after the conquest. Probably within 300 years after the Exodus, King David drove out the Jebusites from Jerusalem and made it the capital of his kingdom. The Jebusites were a Canaanite tribe that inhabited Jerusalem prior to the rise of King David, approximately 1,000 years before Christ. Prior to this time and during this time, the Israelites were constantly fighting for the land against a group known as the Philistines. It is during this era that the archaeological record begins to show up and verify some of these facts. The Philistines first appear on the archaeological record in the 12th century before Christ, probably not long after the Exodus. They were a people of Aegean origin. They probably came from Crete, Greek islands. They immigrated to Egypt, and from there they made their way into what today is referred to as Palestine. The area that they occupied was known as Philistia, or the land of the Philistines. Later in history, the Greeks would use the term Palestine, which originates from Philistia, to refer to this land. After the death of Solomon, King David's son, the kingdom was divided into two parts: the northern kingdom, known as Israel, and the southern kingdom, known as Judea. The descendants of King David ruled over the southern kingdom. King David was from the tribe of Judah. Judah was one of the sons of Jacob. From him, we get the name Judea. The northern kingdoms existed as an independent state until the year 722 BC, when they were conquered by the Assyrian Empire. Many of its inhabitants relocated to the southern kingdom of Judah, while many others were taken into captivity and dispersed throughout the continent. It is at this time that the Hebrews, or Israelites, became known as Jews, a name derived from Judah or Judea. The southern kingdom continued until the year 586 BC, when they were taken into captivity by the Babylonian Empire under the rule of Nebuchadnezzar. The latter conquered and took possession of the region known as Palestine. At this time, the Philistines disappeared from history, and it is believed that they immigrated to Greek regions and were integrated back into Hellenist culture. In the year 539 BC, the Babylonian Empire was overthrown by the Persian Empire, led by King Cyrus the Great. The Persians allowed the Jews in captivity to return to their land and allowed them to rebuild their temple. In 331 BC, Alexander the Great completed the conquest of the Persian Empire after decades of war. The Greeks took possession of the promised land. After the death of Alexander the Great, his successors were not very nice to the Jews. There were multiple attempts to drive them out of their land, to destroy their faith, and to forcefully assimilate them into Hellenist culture. It is during this time that the Greeks renamed the land formerly known as Israel to Palestine. It was an attempt to disconnect the Jews from their land. In spite of this, the region was still known as Judea in the early years of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire gradually grew into power and overthrew the Greek Empire by the year 146 BC. The Roman army marched into Jerusalem in 63 BC under the leadership of Pompey, and soon thereafter they took control of all of Palestine. The Jews remained living in Judea under Roman rule. Jesus Christ was born and lived during this time. He was crucified by Roman authorities around 30 AD. Some 40 years after his crucifixion, the Romans invaded Palestine and leveled Jerusalem to the ground. They killed or enslaved most of its citizens. Many fled and were dispersed throughout the world, although a number of them settled in Galilee. In the year 132, there was a Jewish revolt, and many of them tried to return to their land. The Emperor Hadrian stopped the revolt and implemented a series of laws to eradicate Jewish nationalism in Judea. He prohibited the Hebrew calendar, the implementation of Jewish laws, and executed Jewish scholars. He also tried to destroy all copies of the Jewish sacred writings. Hadrian changed the name of Judea to Syria Palestina, or Palestine as we know it. It was his attempt to erase any historical association of Jews with the land. Some 300 years after his crucifixion, the Roman Empire adopted Christianity as the official religion. Christianity went from a persecuted minority to being a state religion, a political entity to some degree. A Christianized Roman Empire ruled over Palestine until the Muslim conquest, which took place in the year 638 of our Common Era. Islam as a religion began early in the 7th century, according to Muslim tradition. However, there is hardly any verifiable history from this period of time, according to Oxford historian Tom Holland. The Muslim Umayyads ruled over Palestine until the year 750, when they were replaced by the Abbasids. The Umayyads are presently referred to as Sunni Muslims, while Abbasids are called Shiites. The Fatimids were also a Muslim Shiite dynasty. They replaced the Abbasid Muslims as rulers of Jerusalem. They ruled from 969 to 1099 AD until they were overthrown by the First Crusade. Western Christians regained control of Jerusalem for the first time in more than 450 years. It remained under Christian control until the year 1187 AD, when the Muslims, led by Saladin, took back Jerusalem and Palestine. Christian crusaders continued to fight for the land against Muslims with some success until the year 1244. From this time until 1917, Palestine remained under Muslim control. The Ottoman Empire, a Muslim empire based out of Turkey, rose later in the 13th century, and it lasted until the 20th century. We have now entered modern history. The Ottoman Empire entered World War I somewhat weakened. They were close to collapsing. The Ottomans joined the Central Powers. They fought alongside Germany against the Allies, which were led by Great Britain, in a battle over the Promised Land. The British took advantage of nationalist movements that had swept throughout the Middle East to recruit Arabs to their side. These were fighting for their independence against the Ottoman Empire. There were many Arabs living in Palestine at this time. The British also issued the Balfour Declaration in 1917. This was a statement announcing their support for a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, which was under Ottoman control. The declaration was also a promise made to the Jewish people with the hope of getting their support in the war. The Jews were a minority group in Palestine at this time. However, the Balfour Declaration began a massive migration of Jews from all over the world into Palestine. These longed for a national state after 1900 years of exile where they had endured continuous persecution. Their plight to establish a homeland and settle in Palestine was identified as Zionism. In the year 1917, the Ottomans and the Germans were defeated in the war and the British took possession of the land. Along with the French, they reconfigured the landscape of the Middle East. The British took possession of Palestine and Jerusalem after 673 years of it being under Muslim control. Soon thereafter, tensions began to rise and warfare broke out between Arabs and Jews, as the former vehemently opposed Zionism. As Europe entered the 1920s and saw the rise of fascism, anti-Semitism began to grow in the continent. As a result, Jews from Europe continued to immigrate to Israel in big numbers, and the British Empire was not able to slow it down. In 1921, the British appointed Amin al-Husseini as the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. He was the Arab representative. During this time, riots and violence continued to rise between Arabs and Jews in Palestine. In 1937, the British proposed a two-state solution, with the Arabs owning 70% of the country and the Jews having 20%. Jerusalem would remain a special entity under British control. The Jews happily accepted the proposal. The Mufti and the Arabs, on the other hand, were insulted by the idea of creating a Jewish state and rejected the idea. Many Arabs celebrated fascist voices who desired to exterminate Jews from existence. As World War II started, the Mufti met with Benito Mussolini, the Italian fascist dictator, in 1941. Mussolini expressed his desire to exterminate all Jews from Europe and from Palestine as well. The Mufti met with Adolf Hitler next. The Fuhrer expressed his desire to eliminate all Jews residing in the Arab sphere. He confided with the Mufti that the Nazis had already exterminated more than 3 million Jews. The Mufti was elated with the idea of a genocide against all Jews and became a supporter of the Nazi cause. Most Arabs in Palestine were rooting for the Germans to win the war, while Jews were terrified that a German triumph would lead to their genocide. As history tells us, the Allied powers led by the United States, England, and the Soviet Union won the war by 1945. The Jews were spared from complete annihilation. Tensions continued to rise between Arabs and Jews living in Palestine, which remained under British rule. By 1947, the British, tired of the bloodshed, decided to get out of the region, and they turned it over to the United Nations. On November 29, 1947, the United Nations voted to create a Jewish state. The resolution passed with 33 nations voting in favor, led by the United States and the Soviet Union. 13 nations voted against it, and 10 nations abstained from voting, including Great Britain. Immediately, riots broke out in Palestine, and many voices were heard calling for the extermination of all Jews. Great Britain scheduled May 15, 1948 as the date that they were going to pull out of the region and comply with the mandate of the United Nations. Before the date even arrived, Arab nations came together in a plan to attack the newly formed nation. Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon invaded Israel on May 15, 1948, with the specific mission of exterminating the Jews. However, Israel unexpectedly and miraculously came out victorious after 10 months of fighting, and the Jews expanded their territory. Jerusalem was split in half. On April of 1949, a settlement was reached with the supervision of the United Nations. Jerusalem was divided into two parts. The Jews were given the western side, and King Abdullah of Jordan was given the eastern side and the West Bank. Under the agreement, the Jews were allowed to visit their holy sites. However, the agreement was not honored. The Jews were not allowed to pray at the Western Wall for another 19 years. In 1967, the same nations attacked Israel with the same intention of exterminating all the Jews from the land of Palestine. This is known as the 6-Day War, because in just 6 days, Israel defeated all their enemies and once again expanded their borders. This time they took over Jerusalem and their holy sites. This is where the situation stands today, although there have been some formal agreements and treaties where Israel has returned some of the territory they gained after the wars. Palestinian Arabs and virtually all Muslim nations still claim that the land we commonly refer to as Palestine belongs to them. There are many others who support their views, mainly folks who are on the left of the political spectrum. Based on the information given, which are the facts of history, I am going to make a historical and legal argument that this is not the case. Those who support the view that the land belongs to the Palestinians call it occupied territory. The facts of history tell us that the entire world is occupied territory. All the nations of Europe and the Middle East have been conquered and reconquered by various empires throughout their history. Islam itself, as a religion, is a political movement that invaded and conquered other nations and people throughout its history. Islam was founded in the middle of the 7th century. By the end of this century, they had sieged and conquered Jerusalem. In 710, they invaded Europe and conquered Spain. They would have continued deeper into Europe if not stopped by Charles Martel in 732, the Frank ruler. Spain was under Muslim rule for 700 years. There are Muslims who still claim that Spain belongs to them. Is Spain occupied territory? The Ottoman Empire also incurred deeply into Europe. They took over most of Eastern Europe. They were stopped in Austria, or else they would have conquered all of Europe. The Ottomans took over the Christian seat of the Eastern world, Constantinople, and eventually changed its name to Istanbul. In fact, whenever Islam conquered areas, they completely changed its culture and religion. They imposed taxation on Jews and Christians, persecuted, forcefully converted, and killed many of them. Those from other religions were completely obliterated. Christianity began in the Middle East. Turkey, Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon were all seedbeds of early Christianity and became predominantly Christian. Islam conquered these areas and drove Christianity out by the sword. In recent years, we have seen further reduction in Christian populations in countries like Iran, Egypt, Iraq, Sudan, Pakistan, and many others through genocide and persecution. Islam, eschatologically, is a religion of apocalyptic conquest. Those who follow the religion fanatically long for a day that the world would be under the submission of Allah, their God, which means that Islam will conquer the world through force. Islam is not a monolithic religion. We must keep that in mind. It has many factions, divisions, and denominations. Different factions have risen to power throughout history and subjugated other divisions of Islam. The Ottomans, for example, begrudgingly ruled over the Middle East against the will of many of the people of these subdivisions of Islam. The facts of history are that if you lose the war, you lose the land. These are the cold facts. Unfortunately, it is not a perfect world. Historically, the Arabs were offered to have an Arab state greater in size than what the Jews were offered by a nation that was sovereign over the area, and they refused the offer. This is a legal fact. Instead, they chose to join forces with the Axis powers, an evil anti-Semitic movement. They lost the war, and as history teaches us, the spoils belong to the winners. In spite of this, they received grace. The British did not eliminate them from the region like they wished to do with the Jews. They were still allowed to negotiate for the land. The United Nations legally and overwhelmingly voted to create a Jewish state. It was smaller in size than the area given to the Arabs. However, the Arab nations refused. The losers did not want to compromise. They wanted the entire land for themselves. They went to war with the goal of completely eliminating the Jews from the region. Each time they lost, and they were forced to negotiating. They violated every ordinance and agreement that they entered into after the wars they started, and yet they are still claiming that it is their land. To use the words of Jesus Christ, whom Islam considers a prophet, if you live by the sword, you will perish by the sword. Another claim that those who claim that the Jews have illegally taken possession of the land is that the Islamic Arabs were there first. However, the facts above do not support this argument. The Hebrews were in Palestine at least 2,500 years before Islam was birthed. They were known as Jews at least 1,300 years before Islam came into existence. The Roman Empire ruled over Palestine for over 750 years, and it was a Christian culture for at least 350 years before the Islamic invasion. Some claim that Palestinians were there before the Jews. However, history teaches us that the name Palestinian is a misnomer. Isn't it ironic that the true Palestinians, the Philistines, were conquered by the Babylonians? They were assimilated back into Hellenistic culture and disappeared from history. Modern Palestinians have no relationship with the historical Philistines. I just gave you the historical and legal argument that conclusively prove that the land belongs to the Jews. However, there is yet another argument made by Palestinians and Muslims in general to claim that the land belongs to them. It is a religious argument. Muslims claim that Abraham was a Muslim. According to their traditions, Abraham was commanded by Allah to sacrifice Ishmael, not Isaac. They also believe that the blessing was transferred to Ishmael, his illegitimate son, and that Arabs are the descendants of Ishmael. These are traditions that were added much later to Islam and are not even found in the Quran, their holy book. Muslims also claim that Solomon's temple was a mosque and that it was first built by Abraham. Of course, these ideas are not found anywhere in ancient history or in archaeology. Keep in mind that Islam began 2,000 years after Jewish traditions and writings. Mosques did not exist until more than 2,500 years after Abraham lived. The Jews and later on the Christians were telling the same story way before Muhammad came around. There were no mosques mentioned, nor any mention of Allah in their writings. Again, these terms appear thousands of years later. Islam conquered Jerusalem in 636. It was a city under Christian rule with some Jewish influence. As any conquering power, their aim was to establish their rule and culture. From the beginning, Muslims began a propaganda apologetic campaign to supplant Christian and Jewish beliefs. The historical writings left in Jerusalem from that time testify to this fact. As time went on and they were confronted with arguments against their beliefs, they developed counter-arguments. These arguments evolved over time and formed the traditions of Islam. They served as apologetic propaganda to subjugate and convert the inhabitants of the land that they had conquered. Those who did not convert lived as second-class citizens and were taxed. Others were driven out through persecution or execution. One of the arguments that Muslims used to claim ownership over Jerusalem was taken from a very obscure passage in the Quran, Surah 17. The passage at face value says nothing of what later traditions constructed. The traditions speak of a flying horse type of animal that took Muhammad through a journey to the seven heavens. This creature is referred to as the Buraq. On this journey, Muhammad met Adam, Jesus, and his cousin Joseph, someone who is not found in Christian literature. He also met with Enoch, Aaron, Moses, and Abraham until he finally got to the throne of God. Later traditions even added that the Buraq had the face of a human. The traditions also say that Muhammad traveled on the Buraq to Jerusalem, where he visited the mosque before ascending to heaven. The problem with this narrative is that the mosque was not built until 70 years after the death of Muhammad. Muslims claim the Temple Mount in Jerusalem as holy and as their possession based on this bizarre story. Also, the Quran never mentions Jerusalem. Keep that in mind. Let me address the religious claims of Islam. These claims are unconvincing, and this is why. The Jews also have their own religious claims, and they are much older than Islam. Muslims borrowed from the Jews and Christians to build their religion. Islam may very well be categorized as a Jewish or Christian heresy. Why should anybody believe claims that were birthed much later in history and for political reasons without any historical or archaeological support? Some of the claims that Muslim traditions make would be equivalent to someone in our lifetime claiming that Jesus Christ was an American, a capitalist who fathered many children, and these are the ancestors of all Americans. The names, the places, and the ideas did not exist at that time. Such claims would be difficult for anyone with a rational mind to accept. As to the Buraq and the trip to heaven, Muslims need to prove that flying horses with human faces exist. Show the evidence for these animals. I would like to see one myself. Lastly, in ancient religions, those who came out victorious in war attributed their wins to their gods. They would write in murals, such as the Egyptians, that their gods were more powerful than those of the opposition. The God of the Israelites is portrayed as such in the Old Testament. Therefore, if Muslims want to make a religious argument, then they have to accept that their God has been defeated against all odds by a smaller nation with a smaller army over and over again. Logically, this makes Yahweh or Elohim greater than Allah. Please leave your comments below. If you like the video, give it a like and subscribe to this channel.